years ago, I was doing a piece of perform research, and I experienced a moment on stage. And to use Laurel Richardson's term, it was a moment of crystallization. I was doing a piece about Shakespeare in the elementary classroom, when multiple worlds came together. In particular, my and artist worlds. I was in the moment as an artist and a researcher. Now, did the 100 or so audience members notice? Did they care? Perhaps. But I knew. Because in that moment on stage, my artist and researcher identities crystallized. Now, a number of thinkers and practitioners, including many of you in this room, have tackled this space where the artistic and the researcher collide, combine, the aesthetic, the academic. I'm interested in that space, that shift, the overlap. In my academic researcher role, I strive for clarity. I aim to persuade through argument. I anchor my thinking in current debates, theories, and methodologies, ideally contributing new knowledge. When performing, I layer, I complicate, I get partially lost in the world of the drama. I'm in the moment, prepared spontaneity. Hamlet-like, I ponder, I debate with myself. I make the problems colossal, yet minute, worldly, yet personal. I'm here and there. My academic side troubles, makes stabs, seeks truths, considers the literature. I strive to say something new. I strive to be physically and emotionally present, fully awake, to dream. I observe, I analyze, I organize. I study the trees and seek to organize them in some artful or coherent forest. I am part of that forest. I walk in that forest. I touch the trees. I smell nature. I breathe in the colors. I climb the trees for a better view. And I dwell in that forest. And amidst the doing, I gradually begin to paint meanings, sketches, blotches in time. Time and space are transformed, they're intensified. I'm here and there, in the myriads of strands I capture. I create meanings through prose and poetry. It's this and that. I write, I rewrite, I create, I recreate, I generate, I present, I perform. I'm in Melbourne. I'm in the moment, fully awake, breathing the research, living the art, performing research. So welcome again. We will now begin a 10 minutes brief about precious moments, the process that led to this work, and as collaborators, Rita willingly accepted my invitation to come and see what we do in one of the aspects of theater and drama education world, and in particular this world of performing research. So as a visual artist, she has taken the courage and the time to work with me through this process, and we'll talk briefly about what we were able to achieve in this spectrum of this work and how we were able to journey along. So it'll be only about 10 minutes, and then we're going to jump into the piece that we co-created. And I wanted to acknowledge there's two other names on the list here. Some of you may know Graham Lee because he's done a fair amount of work in this field. He's a recent PhD graduate from UBC. He's now a postdoc, and Rita also worked on Graham's committee. He was instrumental to both Rita and I to help us with the development process, the scripting, and some direction. And Janice Valdez is a new PhD student and was very generous as well in helping Rita and I to begin to shape this piece. So both of them cannot be here in person, but they were instrumental in our process. So I'm going to leave it to Rita to share some of the journey that we've taken.
Yeah, so this is delightful being able to work with George, and so I'm just going to walk you through some of the processes that we deliberate on together. Slide, I think, just positions both of us. If you know any of my work, I've done a lot of work with my own photography in in Forest and UBC, but also George runs a lot. And this is very indicative of the kind of facilitation that we did, because in the development processes that we went through in coming to a story, we were able to collect a lot of materials that helped us actually develop the story. I just want to point out that there were 3 phases to how we proceeded, and they're illustrated right here. So just going a little more carefully into developing a story, we were able to collect some images, speak to those images, talk about them, narrate them. We had 5 two-hour sessions. In each of those sessions, we were able to share some of our own autobiographical stories. We narrated some of those stories. We spoke them for each other. We explored ideas about identity. And early on, we talked a lot about, can we remember some of the first stories about when we thought about becoming an artist, for instance. Obviously, it was very drama-based, and there were particular kinds of facilitation that happened that Graham and Janice, as well as Graham, were able to lead me through, as well as all of us. And you can see some of those here with playback theater, tableau, role-playing, improvisation, and scripting. What was interesting to me is that through all of this, this process, is that it was always it was never directed. It was always about the unfolding. It was always about us bringing things together and to work from what we had brought together. The co-facilitation, I thought, was really tremendous to be a part of. Obviously, it was initially led by George, but as he said, Graham and Janice were a big part of that. It was with them about it later because the roles were reversed in that working with their supervisors and directing us on what we were doing. It was comfortable for me, but as time went on, we talked about it. There was times where they spoke about how that was unique and sometimes challenging for them. Here are just some images. For instance, there was a time we talked about kind of the cracks in our experience, and we shared some photographs of meaningful times where there was these in-between spaces that held some meaning for us. I'm not going to go in depth in these, but just to show you how we collected a lot of things and spoke on a crack in a vase near her home, where she had taken it for granted for a long time. But here it was, something that she could speak to and think about more carefully and deeply. As time went along, we were able to work in a room where there was a whiteboard, and we made notes to ourselves as we were going through this facilitation. So you can see some of the ideas here that we played with. Is my identity really unique? Et cetera, et cetera. And so when we came back to this whiteboard from one week to the next, somebody named there, ready for us to think about them. We also had an occasion where, as we went through some of our ideas, we asked each other to actually draw out the geographical space, or the spaces in which one another think about the space of our stories were taken. This one is one of mine, and the first one was one of George's. The second phase had to do with scripting and blending. But this is a very important one, in which now we've collected a lot of these of the stories, of the images and the artifacts, and now it's time to actually try and create something that's coming together. So there was a concentration at this point in trying to take George's stories and my stories and to see how they interconnected. Now keep in mind, I said at the beginning, we only started with kind of a broad notion about identity. So what you're seeing today was was a surprise to us, I suppose, over time. It wasn't something that we had initially known about, even with our stories, let alone putting these stories together. So Graham and George were responsible for creating the draft and many drafts, and as you can see, up to draft 10. And we even did go through some of the rehearsals with earlier drafts. Here's just so you get a sense, we worked in a small space with some of the facilitation and explained through some of the points of the various stories. And then, of course, with rehearsing. So the process we went through here, the script kept evolving. me being fairly new to this process, I was memorizing, and then the next thing I knew, I didn't need to memorize that. That was okay though. Anyway, the script was evolving, and there's good reasons for that evolution. And as it was evolving, we were finding our characters and moving through the theater. And of course, all the time, we were always the exploration of movement in space, and certainly with the relationships between the characters and with. And one thing that I found interesting too was just always trying to remind ourselves to kind of let go of the academic, to really be in the space, and to let the creative processes emerge. We'll go to George rehearsing. I don't remember what that was about. And of course, playing with our scarves. I'm going to turn over to George now.
So very briefly, why performing research? And yeah, so some of the, I would say some of the commitments that we wanted to do with this particular presentation. As Rita said, our initial idea, we're both involved in a teacher education program in Dadaab, Kenya, with working with teachers working in a refugee camp. And that was one of our initial ideas, to come and share some of that work, but it's not quite ready, and it's a big project. So when we came to this, it was still the commitment to just to bring someone from visual art. What can I learn from Rita, and what can we start to come together as we explore in different art forms? Because our field wants to grow. We want to be not necessarily understood is not the right word, but we want our work to resonate in other fields. And so widening the scope was important to me. And of course, always exploring this spectrum of what is the continuum of perform research. And we've seen this throughout the last 2-3 days. There is a whole variety of this kind of work. So that was a commitment as well, was how can autobiography, are we just looking at ourselves and going, okay, we're going to tell you our stories? How can we go beyond that when we start the weaving and the blending? So what is part of the spectrum is explored. Looking at intended audiences, it is always important. Who are we doing this for, and why? So that was another commitment through the process. And finally, I think a number of us work with students, and we take them through some of these processes. And sometimes we haven't done these processes for a while. So to do as I preach, as I take students through these monologue works, or I call them learning moments in teacher education, where they go back to something that meant something to them, and I take them through a theater process. It's important for me to then carve out some time and go through that. So when I'm leading them, I get the sense of where they're going and those experiences. So that's very much in a nutshell. The crux of what we want to share is our performative piece. It's about 18 minutes long, and as I said, it's along the continuum. We've had some chance to go through those phases, and we've gone as far as we can go given the time. So sit back, enjoy, and precious moments.
Anything today? Fresh bread. It's not always fresh bread. Some days it's flower arranging. For ceramics, textiles. Other days it's painting. This was her studio where she creates. My mind, my mother was an artist, and I wanted to be one too. Fresh bread that ignites my creative thoughts. What tonight? Work on those cards for that class party. I could finish that handmade book I was working on. I could redecorate my bedroom. Oh, everything is coming alive around me. I can smell more fragrances. I can hear more delicate sounds. I can see more colors and images and patterns and textures and ideas. Of course they all belong to something. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the movement of my body, the movement of my mind, the movement of ideas. It doesn't matter what. It only matters that I do, that from these some things, something that didn't exist before was created. Something precious.
Gap. divide, crevasse, bridge, overlap, in between, hockey, theater, brother, French, English, brother, Don. Strong, smart, stubborn. When all the other 10-year-old boys were playing hockey and team sports, my brother Don, he put on his snowshoes and set out to the forest to check his traps. He spent hours in the gym, poised, disciplined. He always sought new horizons, new adventures. Rock climbing, ice climbing, mountain climbing. He climbed in groups, as a guide, and often alone. His younger brother, George, that's me. Chatty, social, outgoing. I love team sports, and hockey in particular. If I wasn't playing on the ice, I would be playing in our garage. Sometimes I play with friends, but often on my own, playing for hours. Play-by-play broadcasting each move. Belliveau, il prend la rondelle. Il passe à le blanc, qui passe à Belliveau. À le blanc, à Belliveau, à le blanc, à Belliveau. Lance, compte, c'est le but! I knew all the nooks and crannies in our garage. I was in my element, playing.
Childhood creativity. Childhood playing.
Childhood playing.
Unfolding.
Unfolding.
Evolving and dancing. Through time untold. Time never measured. Time of wonder. In a
imagined worlds.
Where time stands still and yet miraculously expands to fill eternity.
Expands to fill eternity.
We do a lot of things together. There's something precious about Rita. She has an artistic eye and delights in all forms of creating. I love creating too. But watching her, oh, that's just such a special time. After school, she'll bring out a collection of materials from the bedroom to the kitchen. And on the kitchen table, as each masterpiece emerges, well, the collection just grows and grows. Out of these things, she's able to create something special.
Don and I, we grew up in French, in a small Acadian village in eastern Canada called Memramcook. It's an Aboriginal name meaning crooked river. When Don was 10 and I was 9, our friend Luc, he slid in that river while fishing. That was the first funeral I ever attended. And each time that Don and I, we crossed that bridge over that meandering river, we never talked about why we did that. We just did. In our teens, Don and I started to listen to English radio and television. We stumbled through English newspapers and magazines. We even met some friends from the neighboring English town. And then, with our thick French accents, we set off to Université en anglais, in English. Don, he fell in love with robotics and made for the theater. When not studying, he was climbing and I was playing hockey. From theater to hockey dressing room, I traveled. From lab to mountains, he journeyed. I was wrestling with Shakespeare, butchering the language. He was staring at the Himalayas, clenching for dear life. But Don summited Mount Tilicho, one of the great peaks in the world. And as Duke Orsino in Twelfth Night, I left behind my French accent.
Last Valentine's Day, Rita decided to make handmade cards for her classmates. She started collecting images and clippings from newspapers and magazines. I bought her construction paper. She started collecting fabric with all kinds of textures and all the range of colors of the rainbow. Soon that wasn't enough. Then there was tracing paper and pins and buttons and lace and rickrack and who knows what else. And as bedtime crept closer, I tried to put the materials away. Well, the kitchen was just chaos. Crafts and cooking, they don't mix. The dining room was always in order. Lace tablecloth, the centerpiece, everything was just so ready for a special occasion. What is the cost of order? I decided to relinquish the order of the dining room to the chaos of Rita's creativity, at least for a few weeks. She just beamed. It was like I'd given her a precious gift. I suppose I had. I had given her a studio. Now, no more lace, just a plastic tablecloth and a collection of materials became the centerpiece.
He doesn't know that I can hear him mumbling the play-by-play in the garage. Oh, that George, my youngest, he always loved to talk. It's as if he has his own stage and hockey rink inside the garage. You know, it'd be nice sometimes to have the car inside the garage, especially when it's snowing in a Canadian winter. But it's best to leave it out to avoid the scratches and dents. He plays there for hours. His brother plays with him once in a while, but Don, he'd rather be out in nature, out in the forest. You couldn't have two different boys, really. I mean, one can't stop talking, and the other, he hardly says a word. But still, they're good friends. They take care of each other. Now, when they come home from university, they still stay in the same bedroom. Even though we have two other bedrooms sitting empty. They'll sit and chat till the wee hours of the night, and then they'll wake up bright and early, and they'll set off together. Don will go to the gym, and George will go for a run.
I long for those precious days
when
creativity playing, filled my time without duration. Only a mesmerizing, enveloping of unyielding imagination, embracing my being and becoming.
I was only at UBC a year and a half, and I saw the perfect conference advertised in North Carolina. But how could I go? It was in the first week of class. Should I go? Or shouldn't I go? Tugs. Okay, I'll go. I'm normally quite frugal with my time and finances. I usually go to a conference and come right back. This time, I just felt like I should stay a bit longer. When it came time to go to one of the prearranged tours, I just felt like I should explore the city. So I set out on my own. Oh, it was a glorious day. Bright, sunny, warm, and inviting. Oh, the streets were lined with trees. Boulevards were beautifully manicured.
You just saw Rita.
Oh, the store was a feast of color and design. Hand-painted porcelain flowers. Oh, pastoral scenes, landscapes. hand-painted china plates. My mother painted porcelain. She became the artist she always wanted to be in the last 10 years of her life, when she finally found a teacher. To me, my mother and I were always creating.
Sociable Rita.
Hello. Hello.
Oh, hello.
This porcelain is extraordinary.
It is, isn't it?
Try again, Rita.
My mother painted porcelain. She would have loved these.
Oh, really? Where are you from?
I'm from Canada. I grew up in Alberta. Do you paint porcelain?
I love to paint porcelain. In fact, some of these pieces are mine.
Keep talking, Rita.
May I ask your name?
Kay. Kay Godshack.
My mother's mentor. My mother's porcelain art teacher. My mother was on the way to the airport to take a course from you when she died in a car accident.
It's hard to explain exactly what happened. You see, I was climbing, and I was on top of the world. I mean, I was at 4,000 meters and almost touching the clouds. And then I was at 3,000 meters. I remember sliding, and I remember looking for my backpack, and oh, but look at the moon. I was playing the director in Pirandello's 6 Characters in Search of an Author. It's a demanding role. I was also doing another play at the same time in French, and I was finishing my teaching degree. And I was fully sleep deprived, and it happened in Act 2. I completely lost it. I didn't know my lines. The actors were there, they weren't. I was there, and I slowly started drifting into this other world. And how long have I been sliding? 30 seconds? 30 minutes? Oh, just look at the sun rising in the mountains. Just breathe in this beauty. So I'm there on stage, and I'm completely lost. I don't know my lines, and excuse me, could you just move the stool over towards Madame Pache's dressing room? And you, could you stop crying, please? So I have no idea where I am. How long have I been lost? For 5 seconds? 5 minutes? Oh, but just look at the sun filling in the valleys and peaks. I've never seen a sunrise like this. Am I awake? Am I dreaming? Oh, my shoulder. Oh. Where's my backpack?
Mr. Director, can we show you the scene between the father and daughter?
Sir, this confession tale between you and your daughter is touching, but it won't play on stage. What we do here in the theater is make-believe. Once in your life, George, you have to see the sunrise in the mountains. It's absolutely beautiful.
Kay and I reminisced for hours. She shared with me details about I shared with her details about my mother's accident. Stories she had never heard. She shared with me stories about my mother and her art. How she embraced it with joy and passion. Stories I had never heard. time stood still. Kate told me she didn't actually work in that store. She was filling in for her daughter that day while she was visiting her. I decided to go to the conference, to stay a bit longer, to walk into the streets on my own and into that store and then force myself into conversation. These thugs, my mother.
My brother,
Oh, Mom.
Don. His passion and determination to test his limits, to seek the new possibilities, to live each day fully, never ceased. Carpe diem. The second time he slid,
Yeah.
in the rugged Canadian Rockies, amongst the beauty of rocks and snow and endless sky,
Divide.
he wasn't so lucky.
Crevasse.
But now, each time that I get lost, when I begin to slide, he gives me a push
Hug.
or a kick in the butt. But he helps me see the beauty and find my way.
We're still connected.
We're still connected.
It was art. And it was letting go. It was letting go and listening.
And listen,
It was letting go
letting go,
and listening.
and listening.
It was letting go
Go
and listening.
and listen.
Supposed to go back there. I didn't go back there.
We didn't practice our bow, so
There we go. There we go.
thank you. And thank you, Penny and Richard, for
Not
volunteering.
necessarily artographic perspective, but we did call our presentation Precious Moments Artographic Performance. So we do have Rita, who has been instrumental in really developing this art-space methodology. So she's going to
So it really is a privilege to be a part of this, and I'm especially intrigued by George's opening monologue. And in that one, he talks a lot about becoming artist, becoming researcher. And in this piece, I feel that we did both of those. But I also think that we explored becoming teacher. I say that because from my own perspective, the idea of becoming artist, becoming researcher, becoming teacher is something that I'm particularly attached to. But I want right now just to emphasize this notion of becoming, because this becoming is where we are always in a state of movement towards the potential of something else. It's when we remember where we started, we recognize the artist that is always emerging. And I'd like to think the teacher is always emerging. And in this particular play, those instances became precious moments, because those moments were not solitary, but actually in connection with others, and often with family members. So I think this piece really explores early spaces of becoming. Sometimes we're asked, why do we do so much autobiographical work in art-based research? And I personally think we need to start there before we can actually do our work collectively with others. Because this is where we create who we are. Becoming artists may start in our formative years, and as this piece exemplifies, we continue in that state of becoming. And at this moment, we are still becoming. We're still becoming our artists, our researcher and teacher selves. And we do this as we act, as we direct, as we script, as we play, as we portray, visualize, and all these creative activities. To me, becoming an artographer is intimately connected to that becoming artist and that state of being. Becoming an artographer is about embracing these identities. It's about embracing our own becoming in these identities. And it's about committing to participating in each of these identities as ways of growing creatively and critically. This piece for me offered a space for the two of us to work together. And although we had worked together before, this was a new experience. It was our first time performing together. So I have to say I really value George's patience with me. And yet, as I thought about it some more, maybe it's not really about patience. Maybe it is about recognizing that being in the presence of another person's becoming is a place of valuing, of witnessing, of appreciating our own becoming. It's trusting in the process. So is artography different from reformed research or any other forms of arts-based research? I'm not sure. I think we're all a network, and we emphasize particular things at a particular given time. For me, what I want to bring to this particular space is to remind us that even though we are really making sure that we're embracing our artist selves and our researcher selves, but not to forget about that teacher-learner identity. That even in these stories, they were present. And many of us are working in educational institutions. And what does that practice as an educator, as a learner, mean to our other identities? I think for this piece to continually be a part of that unfolding of artography, more still needs to happen. Because in artography, as in many forms of arts-based research, it doesn't end. A performance is not the end. It's a part of the journey along the way. So to do that, I think it's really about theorizing and practicing. It's about us continuing to think about our practice, continuing to think about how we're theorizing our activities. I noticed earlier in the symposium, just on that sheet that was given out, about how people are interested in thinking about the conditions of performed research. And it caused me to think about how I've understood the conditions for artography. And in some of the early work, we've talked about those conditions as being based in relationality. It can be about relational aesthetics, about relational pedagogy, about relational inquiry. And certainly in my experience with this particular process, it couldn't have happened without that relationality, whether it was with the two of us or whether it was with the four of us. I also really appreciated that the kind of respect and engagement that we had for one another as we were working through this process. And so, although I won't speak to each of those forms of relationality, I think that they are very much a part of everything that we were doing. Also part of artography, there's been lots of discussion around not just embracing methods that we typically find in qualitative research. And certainly that happened here, where we brought in artifacts and we collected stories and we mined those stories for themes, etc. But particular to arts-based research, we want to look at some of the concepts, those prevailing ideas that come from the artistic form. And I think that came through here. Because as we were creating this piece, we were facilitating the process all the time. So it wasn't that the piece was created and then it was performed. The performance was evolving as the piece was evolving itself. So the artistic form spoke to the piece, and the piece spoke to the form. So I always like to just mention that as we do this work, to really remind ourselves that it's through these, I think, engaging intellectual concepts that we need to keep reminding ourselves that we want to work, want to help ourselves to evoke, to provoke, to interrogate, to examine, to probe, to incite, to illustrate, to make complex, and sometimes even to simplify, but not at the expense of understanding the particulars. Some of you have studied artography, and so I thought to myself, I'll just share a couple examples of concepts that I felt really emerged in this piece. One of them was openings. There were so many openings in the process here, where the piece could have gone all kinds of directions. But what I found was so wonderful about working with this group of individuals is that we remained open to the process all the time. And we didn't stabilize anything too soon. I think that's really important. The other concept I want to just mention is the notion of reverberation, a kind of dynamic engagement that happens when you're, I think, working with ideas. If we hadn't had that kind of dynamic piece, I'm not sure that George and I would have even ever shared these stories. George and I have been working at UBC for 20 years together. We never knew any of this about our own histories. So I think that this work opened or explored openings and reverberations, and it added other conceptual renderings, obviously, that are probably more suited to theater. One person that we both worked with on PhD, who employed some aspects of artography, spoke about one conceptual rendering as the fourth wall, the audience. And I think that's still something I'm working through in terms of understanding the interaction of the audience in the piece. So just to finish off here, what I'd like to say is I think with artography at least, there's a sense of practicing and theorizing ourselves, and that we need to be engaged in this in a committed way in and through time, in a complementary way. I'm also struck throughout this symposium, and even through our own piece, about how we are constantly interested in understanding how we've come to our identities and how we are engaging with our identities. And so I guess I would just encourage all of us to do this with our colleagues, with those, with people with whom we feel comfortable. So let me leave you with a thought. In visual arts, there's many contemporary artists that have embraced a pedagogical turn in the visual. And they've actually talked about their art as being a pedagogical act. And so I'd just like to invite us to think about here, in this performed research, that it too is a pedagogical act, and to think about how we can embrace that in our work.
Yeah.
Rita, you mentioned the fourth wall, the audience, and this is something that I've been thinking about right through the conference, is the impact or the influence or how the presence of the fourth wall, the presence of an audience, what meaning does it make for you, especially for you as a visual artist? Drama people, you know, when we don't do the drama doesn't exist. So, but for you as a visual artist, when your art exists at any time after you've created it, what does the fourth wall mean to you?
Well, I have the advantage of having worked with someone who's explored that in depth. But it's true that I think some artists are quite separate from the audience with whom their work is engaged in. But I think more recently, a lot of contemporary artists are actually working with their communities, so that there is probably more of an interaction with those with whom that they're working. But in this instance, at least for me, I had several of my colleagues, Graham, George, probably even Janice, keep reminding me that when I am sharing my lines, I am in relationship with someone, and that I need to be in that relationship. I'm not sure I've arrived at that, but it's something that they kept reminding me of, and I was trying to do that. So in a sense, I think that fourth wall is about that relationality, and trying to understand, is it about me working with someone that I'm portraying to, or am I in other forms of theater where you're actually engaging very much with the audience themselves? I'm not sure if I really answered your question.
To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what I'm asking. but since you mentioned the fourth wall, I wanted to bring it up.
Rita and George, thank you. On one level, I find the narrative of the play quite simple, but very multi-layered. And often with a work like that, as an audience member, you can sort of feel that perhaps there's a lot, it was more a case of what you didn't put in than what was there. And I wondered if you could share with us perhaps a little bit more about your developmental process, and indeed whether, you know, what we saw today was only the tip of the iceberg of perhaps the stories that did emanate from your process.
Well, I think like any process like this, no matter if we're mining data from the piece that we saw this morning, where Lyndon had so much data and she had to choose and select which ones. I think in our case, as Rita alluded to, some of it was in constant emergence through the process. Not that we were reinventing our past or our stories, but so what was left behind were some of the, because we tried to work in a drama process and play back ways where, you know, we had conversations or we create scenarios where our mother or our fathers or our siblings might have been responding to it. So a lot of the other voices had to be so-called cut out. But we tried to get what are the essential ones. And in Rita's story, it seemed to be her mother's voice kept coming up. And then, so I think that propelled me to privilege my mother's voice more than my father's voice. And but I think then there was an honesty that came out, because my father, like many from his generation, is a man of a few words. So it was easier to find something that my mom might say. And then with my brother, I think that emerged out of when Rita shared her story about her mother's mentor. So things started emerging from there, then other things got left out. But we had a fair amount of data, and I think the third eye in our process, particularly Graham's third eye of helping us to sculpt the work, and he knew us well enough that he was honoring our stories, but also he was looking at it somewhat artistically. Okay, what is at the essence here? And ironically, Graham's story starts emerging into our story in some ways as well. And instead of resisting that, we embrace that because it is part of that listening. It's part of that process. So it answers part of your question. Thank you, Richard.
Mille merci, Georges et Rita. I was very struck by, there seemed to be a shift between the first piece we saw, which was George talking about his dual identities as researcher and theatre maker, in which there was a juxtaposition of energies, and you flipped from one to another. However, in the body of the piece, there was an overwhelming rhythm. It was very fluid, very flowing, and indeed the choice of the artifacts, the silk scarves, the fact that you were echoing and mirroring each other. We have echoes on the other side of the room, and yet your stories also include, we've had car crashes, slides, deaths. I just wondered if, while you were making the piece, if you had considered a dramaturgy that continued more of those juxtapositions and disruptions that we saw in the introductory piece.
Well, I can respond. You can jump in at any time. We really tried to turn. There was a slide. I think I had one of our slides trying to turn off our academic side so that we were actually busily in the process of doing. However, I think gradually there was a sense that, okay, well, within the piece, what might emerge on that other scholarly side, whatever that might mean. So it was always present, but actually we worked hard to let go and to if we look at artography, to focus on the A of artography, the artist part of it, and knowing that we would come to the research in a more formal way as the process got on. But I think that the teacherly part was always present as well. And I just wanted to comment on the first piece. Partly why I did that for me is this 3-minute piece that really, arguably, as I look at Jim this year and Jude and John and many others, Michael and Lyndon have written about this, Prue and all the Chris, and all these voices. This kind of, for me, it's like 10 years of of thinking about this work and trying to essentialize it in this monologue, whether it's successful or not. But it's that wrestling with, I'm teaching some of this stuff, but I'm also trying to practice it, and then and then you're thinking they're divides, but they're bridges from one place to another.
But the two pieces were actually separate. Okay, because of course we were reading them as a whole performance. So I was just wondering about the.
It's my way of trying to bridge the scholarly talk with the work in a performative way. But yeah. So thank you, Alison, for commenting on the question. Great.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed it. I was really interested, when you were showing the slides with the fractions and the gaps, and the performance for me was about these sort of whole lives that then were cracked and fractured because of the loss that you experienced. And as I was watching it, I wondered, Rita, I think this is more for you. Have you ever then thought about then taking this into art and how you would translate this piece into your artwork?
I just wish my life had more time. But yes, I have given some thought to it, but I haven't been able to actually move very far down that path. But certainly, I think the photographic artifacts. I think there's a lot of potential there. Whether you have a kind of continuous loop of images, or whether you have, I don't know. There's lots of ideas I had around how images could be more a part of the whole piece.
I just wondered too what it would be like for you then to take George of creating that artwork.
Embarrassing myself.
Thank you.
But that was part of the deal as well.
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
Oh, I
I would take that.
Next time.
Yeah.
Perhaps one more question.
Yeah.
Rita, you mentioned there's some artists, contemporary artists that really take on the pedagogical as part of their practice as artists. Is there one or two of those that were particularly inspiring?
Any that would call themselves socially engaged artists, many of them who are working in communities. I can think of some in Vancouver itself, and Gypsy, Calgary, and some others. But there's actually quite a few artists, and there's quite a few that are working in that area now.
All right, well, that was a fascinating session, and I think so many ideas came up through the performance and the interchange and the discussion and the performance. And so thank you both for giving that to us. Can you thank me?